All right, gang, story number 2. Cast your mind back to the statue wars that really started in 2015 after that kid, what was his name, Dylan Roof, shot up that church in South Carolina and killed several people. And that started us down this path of, we can't show the Confederate battle flag anymore. And then it was, we can't have statues of Lee or Nathan Bedford Forrest or Stonewall Jackson. And then slowly but surely it became, we can't have statues of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. Remember, there was a whole op-ed last year in the New York Times which said with a straight face that there was no place in the public square for statues of George Washington because he was a slave owner. That was the only reason why. But cast your mind back to those fights, and you will remember that one of the common themes said by people who were all for taking down those statues was that, look, we're not for taking down history. We don't want to rewrite history or anything. All we want to do is take these statues down from the public square and put them in museums. See, people then will be able to watch them from museums. They will be enclosed. We won't be celebrating them in public spaces, right? That's all that we want. That seemed like, if you were the gullible sort of person, which I know you guys aren't, but a lot of the world is, let's just admit it. That seemed like a very, that seemed like a compromise. That seemed like a workable compromise. Well, here's a quick question, gang. What happens? Can you actually put statues in museums when museums themselves now have to be abolished? And no, that's not a piece from The Onion or the Babylon Bee or anything like that. That actually comes from a website called hyperallergic.com. And the person who actually suggested this idea is one Hannah Baker. And the title of her piece that was published on hyperallergic.com is "We Should Abolish Museums Now." We should remake and reimagine the museum. So there we go. In the same way that abolish the police somehow magically becomes we just need to reimagine how we do policing. Now, abolish museums. This is the great Orwellian part of it. You can say we need to abolish museums and then at the very same time say, well, but that means that we need to reimagine museums. No. Even if you reimagine museums in the way, especially that Baker talks about here, which we're going to get into in just a second, you are destroying museums. You are abolishing the museums. So what does Baker say? What does Baker say? She says, quote, this is from her piece, "As a reformed art historian and a white woman who likes to look, I know that the museum and its accompanying conversations can be stimulating and engaging for viewers. But that pleasure comes at a price I am no longer willing to pay. In order to move with intention to create a caring and loving space for engaging with art, I ask myself and my peers to think deeply about what we are protecting when we protect the museum." And she goes on, "I am for the elimination of the violence that the museum has consistently deployed against black bodies, brown bodies, gender non-conforming bodies, colonized bodies, queer bodies, immigrant bodies, disabled bodies, poor bodies, as well as violence against the cultures that these bodies create and move through. The violence of the museum is constantly put on display, mostly through the work of Instagram accounts and independent curators. Accounts such as Change the Museum, Cancel Art Galleries, and Art Stuff Matters disclose and discuss this violence over and over again." Now, what is this sort of violence? First of all, how the heck are museums actually violently oppressing, quote-unquote, black people, brown bodies, non-conforming bodies, genderqueer bodies, etc.? This is not an actual, if you actually read this whole piece, and I will link to it down in the description box below so that you can read it if you so choose at your leisure and see that I'm not just pulling stuff out of my ear. I'm not cherry-picking stuff or anything. I want to be as fair as I can to Hannah Baker, because only in being fair to her can I actually deflate her preposterousness that is masquerading as an argument. But how are museums actually doing this? How are museums actually doing this? Especially recently, museums, again, intoxicated by the woke anti-culture that has now subsumed pretty much our entire society. I mean, museums are scrambling over themselves to have special displays and special exhibits, etc. Especially now that June is so-called Pride Month, or the Smithsonian itself. They just opened up what was it? A African American part of the Smithsonian Museum. So what is violent about any of this? Well, then you realize that it's not violent. There is nothing about the museum that is violent at all. All she's doing here, what Hannah Baker is doing, is that she's just going through the intersectional list. Because if she doesn't say that someone or some group is being oppressed by the museum, then it weakens her argument of why the museum needs to be abolished. My favorite one, I just have to say, queer bodies. Well, how exactly are museum or museum staff going to tell just by looking that someone is quote-unquote queer or not? How are they going to look at the guy coming in and say, oh, he lives a homosexual lifestyle? Or, hey, that chick, she obviously likes other chicks. Or, hey, you know what? That girl, she looks feminine, she's feminine representing, but she's actually non-binary. Therefore, we have to oppress them. How? How are they actually doing this? That's a question, isn't it? Well, we're going to get into that. She actually kind of provides an answer, but we'll get into that in just a moment. In fact, we're going to get into it right now. She continues when she says, museums exert control over how we vision ourselves, past, present, and future. They are the time loops that hold and hoard the works of art that can help us chart a course towards collective liberation. Through maintaining control of a broad swath of artworks and artifacts, the museum maintains control of the tools that we use to tell stories about ourselves, the tools we use to think about what we can be. So basically, what she's saying, all of this violence comes from the fact that museums are reliquaries of memory. That really is what museums are. When you sit down and think about it, museums are places where the past is preserved. And what is the past but our shared memory? Okay, it's more than just one damn thing happening after another, as Henry Ford so famously described history. History and the past, it is our collective memory itself. And that's actually one of the primary reasons how a people actually becomes a people. And I'm not just talking about American people, I'm talking about anyone. Nigerians, Mexicans, Peruvians, Frenchmen, Russians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Israelis, Australians, Chadinese, let's see, what else? Malaysians, Malians, Algerians, everyone. The past, your collective experiences together as a group, or so-called a natural group, a natural group, for example, that helps define you by contrasting you with everyone else. Everyone needs that. Everyone needs that collective memory. Everyone does. So, for example, the fact that Americans, our forefathers, declared their independence in 1776 and revolted against the British Crown when we had been British colonies, that is part of our collective memory. That is part of what separates Americans from the rest of the world and from all the other peoples who populate the world. The Magna Carta, that is part of the collective memory of Englishmen. It's what separates them from the rest of the world. You dive into the mythologies of American Indian tribes, and you will find that a lot of those myths, a lot of those stories are in some sense collective memories of what the tribe has gone through in its past. And it is used to separate tribes from others. And in fact, that was very important in American Indian societies because for so many tribes, they were the principal people. Their stories, their collective memories, their past, their culture was inherently superior to all the other American Indian tribes, which is why, of course, You know, you could steal their horses. You could just decide to, you know what, we're going to go to war with them. You could, you could steal their women and bring them back to your tribe to grow your tribe, etc. You could do all of this because your tribe was inherently superior to all the others. And one way that superiority was held on to, that idea of superiority was held on to, was through collective memory. So it's something that we all need, and museums are one way that we actually preserve that. She's absolutely right. But this now is violence. This now is violence against everyone who apparently does not fit the quote-unquote paradigm of white, straight, cisgendered man. Because, of course, as we know, through intersectionality, if you don't belong to that group, then you are oppressed, and those white dudes up there are just oppressing you. So, for some reason, museums are just reliquaries of white, straight, cisgendered, patriarchal men, which means that they are oppressive. So how do we actually fix this? Well, Baker, excuse me, not Barker. I'm thinking about Bob Barker, the paleontologist. But Hannah Baker, she says in her piece, this is her cure for it. Quote, "There is an opportunity in the abolition of museums to create something caring and joyful. Care and joy are the necessary springboards of our new museums. Abolition will look like many things. Repatriation of artworks and artifacts that have been stolen, paying community members and cultural workers to create repatriation processes that are less about legality and more about repairing harm, cutting ties with the board of directors, creating community guidance councils, opening up museums for housing and shelter, making entrance to museums free, and allowing people to curate shows that are meaningful to them. These are just a few ideas for how to make a start. This work is necessarily a collective project, collaborative and challenging. Museum abolition asks us to reckon with what we understand to be art works or objects of study and how we engage in the practice of ownership, how this ownership relates to care, and how we can look at things and attempt to understand that which we do not control or own." Besides the fact that, according to intersectionality and critical race theory, that you can't do that, because you can never break, if you are a white person, quote unquote, you can never actually break out of your white lenses, which is why you have to ask actual people who belong to, quote unquote, minorities to actually tell you what you're doing wrong. But that in and of itself is emotional labor, and that's just another sign of white supremacy and white fragility. And so you see the loop that we're on, you can never actually break out of it. So how are we actually going to understand that which we do not control or own? How are we actually going to do that, Miss Baker? How are you actually even going to be able to do that? I don't think you can, by the logic of your own philosophy that you have obviously drunk deeply from. But anyway, what she is saying here, let's just think about a few of these things, okay? No board of directors. That means there is absolutely going to be no directive control from the top. And you know what? Board of directors can be stuffy. They can be stuffed shirts, but they also keep the museum on its path. They are supposed to keep the museum truthful to its goal, of its purpose, which is preserving part of our history. And again, it's not all of history. In Philadelphia, there is the Museum of the American Revolution. Its goal is to preserve our collective memory about the American Revolution, the very start of our country. So that means, yeah, a lot of history is actually not touched by that museum. You don't talk about Aztec history, you don't talk about Civil War history, you don't talk about specifically Black American history, you talk about the Revolution. If the Museum of the American Revolution all of a sudden decided to throw in, Pawnee history over here from 1500, Civil War history over here, Black Americans from Georgia from 1805 onwards, all of a sudden it wouldn't be the Museum of the American Revolution. It would just be this meaningless hodgepodge, which means that it would be nothing. When she says too, allowing people to curate shows that are meaningful to them. That means, that's code for people who belong to the right groups will be able to create shows, exhibits that are meaningful to them, that in other words promote their ideology, that promote their narrative. But again, it will only be certain people because, of course, as Ibram Kendi has said, the only way that you're going to erase racism from the past is by active racism now. And that, of course, is going to mean, we talked about just a few weeks ago, actually, in our big video about the imagination. Dan L. Peralta, I think. I've already forgotten his name. But the classics professor who wants to get rid of the classics. He has openly said that the only way that you're really going to get rid of racism in the classics is by white people not publishing anything in that field. And if they actually refuse to stop publishing things, then you're just going to have to reject their works, no matter how good it is, how scholarly it is, how intriguing, how original it is, and just publish people based on their skin color, because that's the only way that you're going to get rid of racism. To get rid of racism, we have to reduce people only to the color of their skin, to a color code. That's what we have to do. It's going to be the same thing here, gang. And I cannot emphasize enough the danger that this is. Museums will no longer be reliquaries of a people's memory, of collective consciousness, we might call it. Collective consciousness, that's actually an interesting idea, because here's the thing. Only by knowing who you are as a people can you actually be free. Baker talks about collective liberation. But making museums, abolishing museums, getting rid of that collective memory about who makes us Americans, who makes us Americans, Americans, who makes Mexicans, Mexicans, who makes Brazilians, Brazilians, who makes Nigerians, Nigerians, who makes Sudanese, Sudanese, etc., etc., etc. That is going to not be liberating. That is going to be enslaving, because all of a sudden, you're just going to be an amorphous mass that's slugging through the world, completely interchangeable, too, with anyone else. If there's nothing differentiating you, like if there's nothing differentiating an American from a Mexican, or a Mexican from an Algerian, and nothing separating him from a Syrian, nothing separating him from an Indian, nothing separating him from, I don't know, a Chatistani, let's say, then you're saying that everyone is interchangeable. But if you say that everyone is interchangeable, then you're saying that the color of your skin, your ethnicity, your culture, your race plays absolutely no part in anything. Because you could just replace them with a white dude from Russia or England or America, and it'd be the exact same thing. There's the contradiction that we're in, as we always get to in these ideologies. That's the danger. It was destroy all statues first, put them in museums. Now museums themselves are in the crosshairs. Museums themselves now are the enemy. And I have to make one more note, gang. Hannah Baker, this is from hyperallergic.com. She's a recent graduate of NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, where she created a concentration in art stewardship and museum abolition. And you wonder why American youths are as egotistically stupid and ideologically blind as they are. That is story number 2.